Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I am a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. And I thought I'd lead off the episode with two small announcements, if you will forgive me for inserting them here. First, I wrote a book. That book is called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. The purpose of it is just to encourage you in your exercise of freedom, to give the confidence, the certainty, the boldness that God has given you everything that you need in order to pursue a good and holy life, and that each decision set before you needn't be an occasion of anguish and anxiety, but rather an opportunity for His glory and your salvation. That's the idea. So I hope you enjoy it. There's a link to it in the description of the video. Check it out. Second, I contribute to a podcast called Godsplaining. I don't know why I'm cracking myself up over here. That doesn't constitute an announcement because you already knew that. But something that does give grounds is that we're having retreats this summer, which is exciting. So in July and August, we have 3 retreats scheduled. There's one for all comers, one for young adults, and then a young men's wilderness retreat. And you can find the details for all of those at godsplaining.org, and you can also apply there as well. So I hope to see you at one of those. All right. So for this episode, we're going to talk about whether the Pope can be a heretic or whether the Pope can commit an act of heresy. Why? Well, it's an interesting question on its own terms, and Christians have certainly thought about the question over the Church's life. But it's also a kind of destabilizing question. So I think that sometimes when people pose it, they don't necessarily give us the principles, the arguments to think our way through. So I thought in this video we would do just that, so as to give us resources for loving the Church and for professing our faith. So let's get after it. All right, so when we're talking about this question of whether the Pope can be a heretic or whether the Pope can teach something heretical, the big treatments of it come from 2 Jesuits of the 16th, 17th century, St. Robert Bellarmine and Francisco Suarez. So what you're getting is maybe some of their principles, but my conclusions differ from theirs. And these are conclusions based on the testimony of the Church's life, the witness of her saints, and our ongoing reception of her scripture and tradition. So when we talk about this question, I think it's helpful to identify the Church, to get a basic sense of what the Church is, her moral personality, and then how that will actually frame the matter for us. So the Church has the grace, or has the capacity, basically, to set the forth faith indefectably. All right, so without any defect or without the admission of any error. And this is based on what we find in Matthew 16, namely that the Lord promises Peter that the Church won't fail. So you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So this gives us a kind of rough sketch of the Church's indefectibility and of the office that the pontiff, the Holy Roman Pontiff, that the successor of St. Peter occupies in this arrangement. So when we're talking about the Church's indefectibility, we can start with the source of their indefectibility, who is God Himself. So God doesn't change, right? Because if God were to change, He would be getting better or getting worse. He would be getting worse, both of which are nonsense. So God Himself is indefectible, and God chooses to share His indefectible life with us. So He reveals Himself, and He gives us His grace, which is to say that He makes Himself known, and He gives us the wherewithal so as to participate in the divine life that He makes known. So how then do we receive that? I mean, the ordinary means are through faith and sacraments. So St. Thomas will say that like faith applies it spiritually and that the sacraments apply it corporeally, which I think is a kind of beautiful parallelism. That's hard to say. When it comes to faith, there are 2 dimensions. I mean, there are lots of dimensions to faith, but we can identify 2 basic dimensions to faith. First, there's the interior dimension, which we call belief, and then there's the exterior dimension, which we call confession. And you can think about those as kind of like the soul and the body. So we don't want to pit one against another, but confession follows from belief, or confession is our outward expression or profession of belief. And so like Wittgenstein will ask, what's the best image of the soul? And I'll say the body is the best image of the soul. So what's the best image of belief? Confession or profession is the best image of belief. So when we ask this question about the indefectibility of the faith, we're often talking about it in terms of the Church's profession of her faith. So what are we saying? What aren't we saying? We aren't saying that every member of the church will profess the faith in its integrity, without error or defect or fault, at all moments of all times of all generations of the church's life. Because we know that's not the case. So if you're baptized, you receive a baptismal character, you receive a participation in Christ's priesthood, you're constituted a worshiping member, you're admitted to the other sacraments, you have that virtue of faith poured into your heart, you're made a member of the church. And if you subsequently say something erroneous about the faith, you don't cease to be a member of the church. So there are some errors in the life of the church. The question is, what type are permitted and which type are forbidden? A kind of classic example of this dynamic is during the Arian crisis. It seemed that most Christians had actually departed from the profession of the true faith. Now, how can you kind of prove that when you're going from house to house, observing how they worship or how they pray, or have these people actually change their mind depending on the allegiance of their bishop? Very, very difficult to verify. But, you have this kind of classic statement that the world groaned to discover that it had become Arian in the 4th century. And yet, we would profess that the church is indefectible and that her profession of the faith is indefectible. So the faith continues to be professed on the part of the church, by those members of the church, which go up or kind of make up her mystical body, which make up her mystical union. So the church isn't just a kind of lumping together of different individuals taken in the aggregate, and all of them will profess the faith in its integrity and in its truth at every moment of every day. Rather, the church is a mystical person. The church is a mystical body. And as a result of which, there's a unity to her, there's an integrity to her. We profess her as one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. The relationship between the invisible church and the visible church is an interesting question, or the relationship between the Church of Christ and the Catholic Church, as it's described in Lumen Gentium 8, is also an interesting question. But what we're trying to affirm in a very basic sense is that the church has a kind of moral personality, that the church receives this gift of indefectibility of the profession of the faith from her God, who sees to it that she does not fail, who has promised as much, right? And who has seen that promise through from generation to generation. And that there may be members who say this, that, or the other thing, but that gift, that capacity abides. So then, we want to concentrate this question in the person of the Vicar of Christ, in the Holy Roman Pontiff. So he has a kind of peculiar office of setting forth the faith. It's part of who he is to teach and to preach the faith in its integrity and in its truth, and to do so in a certain sense on behalf of the church. He doesn't replace the church, but he is to the church in her visible constitution head to members. So the church's faith and its profession is kind of concentrated in its head, in the Vicar of Christ. So what then does that mean for his different teachings and preachings and pronouncements? There's a kind of range of pronouncements that the Holy Roman Pontiff makes. On the one side, you have kind of off-the-cuff remarks which don't pertain to the substance of faith. He might say, Italy is the best country because it has the best cuisine. That's just a particular judgment of the man. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the teachings which are solemnly defined as pertaining to the church's extraordinary magisterium. So those would be things pertaining to matters of faith and morals which would be pronounced by the Holy Roman Pontiff ex cathedra, all right? And that would be like the doctrine of the Assumption, for instance. So what we have defined at Vatican I is papal infallibility, pertains especially to those lattermost kinds of pronouncements. So you can think about, and this is an image used by an author in the early 20th century, that the Pope's preaching office is kind of like a pyramid. And as you come to the summit of that pyramid, as you come to a point, you have those infallible teachings, which are most rare, but which are most kind of focused upon, or kind of most scrutinized. And as you come to that point, error is more and more and more excluded from the Pope's pronouncements, or is more and more excluded from his preaching and teaching. And the possibility of error is eliminated by the time you arrive at those types of teachings and preachings. So then the question is, what about on these different levels of the pyramid? How do you make sense of what may seem to be erroneous, or how do you make sense of what may even been declared by subsequent generations of Christians to be erroneous? And here, it's helpful to think of a couple of concrete instances. The first concerns Pope Honorius I, who said some things about monothelitism that were subsequently condemned by his successor and by 3 ecumenical councils to follow. Or you can think about the example of John the 22nd, who said some things about the beatific vision, which he was corrected on during his lifetime and then renounced. All right? So these particular teachings don't enter in to the substance of the Pope's teaching office, and specifically to these higher order teachings which come to the summit or come to the point of the aforementioned pyramid. All right? So in order to advance in this conversation, and I'm starting to wrap up here, in order to advance in this conversation, we have to get a sense for what constitutes heresy, and then how the Pope might be implicated or not implicated in that type of claim. So heresy is defined as an obstinate post-baptismal denial of basically a teaching of the faith that is to be held with the divine and Catholic faith. And then it goes on, the definition, the Code of Canon Law says that it may also pertain to kind of obstinate doubt as well. So in this instance, we're talking about obstinacy. So this is something that the Pope has been corrected about, but then continues to persist in teaching and preaching. It's post-baptismal, which means that it's just for Christians, but it's something to be held with the divine and Catholic faith, which means that it pertains to the highest order teachings. So these would be like articles of the creed. These would be like Christological dogmas or Marian dogmas. These would be the types of first order deposit of faith things that issue from the church's scripture and tradition in a relatively straightforward way. So if someone were to deny one of these points, to do so obstinately, so persevere in that error, even after correction, then that would constitute heresy. All right. Then the next question is, what happens to a heretic? The Code of Canon Law says that that person is excommunicated, latae sententiae, so just by the very fact of the thing having been done. But when we ordinarily assess how heresy is identified and then censured, it's typically within the context of the hierarchical church. So you have somebody who says something heretical, usually that person is corrected by his or her pastor or bishop or the metropolitan or the Holy Roman Pontiff himself. But usually it observes a kind of top-down hierarchical structure for its pronouncement and promulgation, because that is ordinarily how correction works in the life of the church. And there you can think about the pertinent passage from the Gospel of Matthew. You go to correct somebody. If that doesn't work, then you bring another person or two along. If that doesn't work, then you bring the church along. And in our experience of the faith, it's ordinarily done by the church's pastors in the context of this more top-down approach of the ministerial priesthood. So yes, so when people observe the fact that there's no one above the Pope to correct him, this is when you usually get kind of strange theories about what happens as a result. So some people will say, by mere virtue of the fact that the sin of heresy is committed, he is deposed. Other people will say, by mere virtue of the fact that the crime of heresy, which is distinct, is committed, he is deposed. Other people will say that he needs to be judged by a council of bishops or metropolitans or whomever who can meet kind of in extraordinary circumstances without their head. The problem, though, with a lot of these solutions is that I think they're false, all right? I would judge that they are false. Because if secret sins could depose one as Holy Roman Pontiff, that's against the good working, or it's against the healthy functioning of the ecclesial body. And certainly, this idea of conciliarism has a very heretical tendency, and it leads to things like the heresy that goes by its name, or sedevacantism, things of that nature, all right? So I've read, or I've kind of encountered the position that this idea of deposition really only occurs once the church in her meditation on these matters begins to move in a more and more, ultramontane direction, right? When we begin to think in more like, what would one call them? When we begin to think in terms of papolatry, when we ascribe great importance to the Pope, and if one can say so, like inordinate importance to the Pope. Because this is the point of introducing some of those initial distinctions about the capacity afforded to the church to set forth the faith indefectably. This is given to the church. Okay, so it is given to the church that she sets forth the faith indefectably. And certainly, this passage that we saw in Matthew 16 pertains in a peculiar way to the Pope, who is the Vicar of Christ and the visible head of the church. But we need to affirm that the charism abides, regardless of whether or not, there might be error in the teaching or the preaching of the Holy Roman Pontiff. Depending on the rank that it occupies, it might rise to a level where it becomes more troubling, or it becomes more disconcerting or confusing or whatever. But we know that the office of truth abides, that the Pope himself won't ever teach in a way that's infallible, which is to say that pertains to faith and morals, pronounced ex cathedra, touching the substance of the faith in these highest order truths, and that in addition, the church herself will retain the capacity, the church herself will retain the identity, which makes it such that she can set forth the faith with this assurance of the truth. So, then what do we do about it? Well, I think with the kind of confidence that the grace of the truth abides, we can, suffer and persevere through the midst of whatever difficulties might arise in the various historical manifestations of the church's life. And, typical ways to go about, encouraging the life of faith among those with whom one to live would be, prayer and penance. And then it seems like it would be the responsibility on the part of the church's pastors, on the part of the hierarchy, to correct a Holy Roman Pontiff were he to make an error, and to set forth the teaching of the church in such a way that it clarified things, that it concretized things for those who might stand to be thrown for a loop by this, by an interjection that was, on the part of a Holy Roman Pontiff, which did not cohere with the church's capacity for setting forth the truth of the faith. I think that at the end of the day, and apologies, this has ended up being longer than I intended. Woof. At the end of the day, I think it's not so much for us to ask like where the error abides or from whence the censure comes or how to go about like the technical process of pronouncing it, because the church has this capacity. The Pope is constituted as her head. We can't be entertaining wild theories that lead to, in themselves, heretical judgments, right? But we need to have the kind of confidence that the gates of hell will not prevail against. So it's for us then, as the mystical body, to continue to profess the faith in its integrity and in its truth, and to do so in the context of a life that is, blessed with the sacraments, that is hierarchically constituted, that is made for the glory of God and for the salvation of souls. So we know, or we believe, and we profess that the church will not fail, and even if the fact of it is obscure at times, it remains true nonetheless. So I think that's basically what I want to say. I'd encourage you, if you have further questions or kind of like a conversation to continue, to do so in the comments to this video, and hopefully that'll bring some further clarity and some further correction. And just to say that the church hasn't pronounced on these matters, so they remain open to a modicum of theological speculation. But I think it's good to just kind of delimit the conversation so as to have a sense for the bounds in which orthodoxy falls. All right, so this is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel and push the bell so that way you get email updates on the things that come in subsequent days, weeks, months, and years. And then if you haven't yet, please do check out Godsplaining, which is a podcast to which I contribute with 4 other Dominican friars, with Thursday episodes and meditations on the scriptures for the weekends during penitential seasons. And guests and live streams and blah, 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 and thus and such. All good things. So yes, my prayers are for you. I'd ask that you please pray for me, and I'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.